No great science should ever put lives in danger. It's not conjecture. It's a fact. Weapons can't be unmade, and they are always used.
Our Hextech dream.
At its heart, Arcane is a story about legacy, what we inherit from the past, and more importantly, what we leave behind for future generations. This theme of legacy runs deep, intertwined with the choice to either perpetuate or break the cycles that define our world. In this two-part series, we'll dive into how Arcane parallels real-world technological advancements and the legacy it leaves behind, focusing on the realms of artificial intelligence and transhumanism. This will be a look at how Arcane uses hextech and chemtech as allegories for these real-world innovations, highlighting the potential benefits and pitfalls of technological progress. Before we get too deep, a quick spoiler alert for those who haven't watched Arcane. While it's not essential to have watched the series for this analysis, it will enrich your understanding. With that said, let's jump into this exploration of legacy, innovation, and the human drive to create a lasting impact. Have you ever heard of threat modeling? To make it simple, it's just exploring a system for potential flaws and then the fixes for those flaws. We model a threat and then find a way to assess it, so maybe that means making sure unauthorized users can't log into a database, and if they can, what would the fallout from that be? Fiction does the same thing for us, allowing allegories and more direct comparisons to explore potential societal problems and fallout from certain issues. We've seen this countless times with AI, and it's likely you're going to see a lot more of that in the future. Before we ever got to the modern-day sensationalist news stories of people falling in love with chatbots, we had fiction exploring what that would look like. Fiction gives us a place to explore the improbable, only with AI, sometimes it feels like we're using threat modeling to explore the scenarios that will be reality in just a few years. And we're going to evaluate Arcane today as that threat modeling scenario. The studio that handled this, Fortiche, they spared no expense when it came to the amount of detail that went into Arcane. From these impact frames showing hidden detail, to even the opening being a less than quiet call to the tragedies these characters would go on to experience. Many of which were calls to famous plays and posters. Jayce gets her Les Mis moment, an iconic image of French culture, paying homage to the studio's home, whereas Viktor sets himself up for the Phantom of the Opera, and even Caitlin sees images of herself mirrored in iconic posters for Macbeth. It's no surprise that with that kind of detail, we could easily go on for another 10 minutes about just the opening scene alone. There is a lot of intent behind this series. Every frame is shaped and feels purposeful. And that includes things like Jinx's ripped clothes or smudged eyeliner reading Vi, or how her birth name powder can be derived from a meme. In her original release, Jayce and her minigun, Pow Pow, was a play on the phonetic meme going around at the time, Pew Pew, in the early 2000s, something that eventually played for the perfect segue to the lore we have now. It goes deep and back at least a dozen years. There's a lot here to touch on, and I know I'm going to miss bits and pieces of this no matter how many times I rewatch it. In spite of my past work for Riot, I really shouldn't be taken as any kind of authority on this subject, so with that being said, let me know your favorite Easter egg and what I missed out on in this analysis. Fortiche itself is now a great example of their own story, as Arcane is something that, for now, stands as the legacy the studio has built. And in a way, it's paved the way for them to modify the legacy Riot Games and League of Legends would also leave. Now, you might have expected me to mention how League of Legends is the legacy that the original developers will leave behind, but I'm not so sure it is. Legacy is a funny thing. It isn't about how we feel. It can be something that's personally profound, but it can also be left for society as a whole. Because of that societal perspective, legacy can be shaped by those outside optics, and that's the way I see League of Legends. That legacy has been overtaken by Riot Games, allowing Tencent to acquire 90% of equity and control in the company, and so it's hard for me to divorce things like that $500 Ari skin and luxury-based marketing campaigns probably funding totalitarian governments from the story of an indie company that changed the global gaming scene. I recognize that my perspective on their legacy isn't what most people will see for Riot Games, and honestly, that's okay too. When it comes to technology, legacy isn't so different. It's a heavy motivator for a lot of folks working in this industry to say that they have something to leave behind and be remembered by. Since we could write, we've been doing everything we can as a species to leave behind messages and let ongoing generations know that we were here, that our life had meaning, and that we don't want to be forgotten. The concept of memory and what it means to be remembered is ancient and profane, codified by various religious beliefs all over the world tied to what memory means to them. To think that it could all be for nothing is a fundamentally human experience and one we actively seek to combat. That kind of thinking is where we get the quote, "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit." At the end of the day, the legacy of technology wants so badly to do this, but often finds what is left behind is hardly ever what was intended. Before I get too deep and spiral down an existential rabbit hole, much like my favorite portrayal of military might in Arcane, there's a core triangle that gives us some insight and perspective today. While Ambessa might go on about the voice, guile, and might of Noxus, when it comes to this video, we've got a technological triangle that guides our parallels. The first point is our foundation at the bottom, old world technology. You can think of it as that sort of steampunk, dieselpunk ideal of technology and all things analog. It's things like the printing press, electricity, gears, swords, and shields. This plays in heavy contrast to the top of our triangle, made up of emerging technology, which we'll be calling New World Tech or Emerging Tech today. New World technology can be separated into the top 2 points of our triangle. The first is AI, symbolized in Arcane through Hex Tech. Just as AI involves creating machines that can think, Hex Tech revolves around thinking runes. Both represent a leap into creating systems that can learn, evolve, and replicate. Hextech and AI are different from old world tech in the same way that a modern calculator and an abacus have the same goals but different systems that they run on. This is where the last point of the triangle steps in. Chemtech and transhumanism occupy this particular corner. We won't be focusing on them too much in this video, but I promise it will get the time it deserves in this series. If you've never heard of this fancy term before, we can boil it down pretty quickly. Transhumanism is the practice of augmenting a biological entity, or to be a bit more fancy, the scientific approach of improving or overcoming the human condition. Ever had a headache and taken some Tylenol? That's transhumanism, a basic form of it, but it's still the practice all the same. There's something about ourselves biologically that we disagree with, and we augment ourselves to fix our human condition. Now, in this sort of reductive take on transhumanism, I bet you're already wondering if these technologies have any crossover, and of course they do. Even though this is a triangle, you're going to find a lot of overlaps here. It's probably more accurate if we made this a Venn diagram, but I already made the fancy triangle animation, so... If this were a Venn diagram, then we would have to explore really quickly the commonality between all points. Just like Arcane, the real world has consequences to innovation no matter what side of the technological triangle we're engaging in. For us, pollution creates a lot of environmental hazards and additional complications of even a mildly industrialized society. But for the world of Runeterra, they combat something called the Grey, a much more on-the-nose and visual representation of the runoff that industry creates, calling back to villains like Hexus out of Fern Gully. But these are just some baseline comparisons, and with those established, let's start exploring things a bit more in depth. Before we can look forward at the likes of the Church of the Glorious Evolved and Viktor's transformation from man to machine, we have to look back at the catalyst for this new wave of innovation. In the real world, we've got a term for game-changing technologies. We call them GPTs, or general purpose technologies, and no, weirdly enough, that is not where ChatGPT gets its name, though it certainly should have been. A GPT, in general, is something that transforms how we interact with the world every day. Think about the car. This certainly is a GPT, but more than that, it has an engine. That's a GPT. It's got gears and pistons. Those are also GPTs. But so are the four wheels it runs on. The ability for us to take all of these different GPTs and weave them together is how we get the best out of modern technology. Isaac Asimov likes to remind us that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So when Jayce says he's trying to bring magic and put it in the hands of the people, it's something that's intended to look like sufficiently advanced technology. Around these GPTs spring up entire industries, and over time alter the expectations that we have of the world around us. For the world of Arcane, GPTs are the center of Piltover's economy and power. The city stands as an allegory to the shiny vision of the future portrayed in the 1960s ideals of Walt Disney's Tomorrowland. Something that became a bit of a trope and symbol for progress and an optimistic view of the future that many altruists could fall for. This is Piltover in a nutshell. They're a symbol of progress built on old world technology with all the glitz and glam to usher in that new tech with applause. But beyond the wealth and access, GPTs in Piltover serve a political purpose. They bolster the perceived power of an individual, family, or organization. Looking at Jayce, we see his family has any standing because they've been attributed to the invention of the collapsible pocket wrench. That is their legacy. The thing about GPTs is that they've often got a pretty heavy economic tie to them. Turns out if your world revolves around the steam engine, companies that make the steam engine come in high demand. This is how companies like Ford and General Motors are able to claim a sizable market stake that they've managed to hold for generations. Early adoption makes the return on investment so much more likely. It's not just a tale we've seen with this classic technology either. It's something you're also seeing play out in real time between tech giants as AI providers. Even though no provider would come out and say it, this is why there are companies and organizations advocating against certain AI providers becoming for-profit organizations, or why others might scoop up smaller companies. The ability for larger companies to try and control who is in the early adoption phase is going to drastically change the legacy of many individuals and organizations. For some, it means their legacy will become an untold story that fails to leave even a footnote in the history books. Piltover's obsession with progress is ultimately how they view their legacy. They are a city that refuses to be forgotten and have defined themselves by the motto of try until you get it right. By comparison, the emerging nation of Zaun, while also being built on old world technology, see it as the reliable and go-to option. It isn't about progress here, but making the most of what's available. Progress can be a byproduct of that, but it isn't always. The goal here is survival, a stark contrast to the neighbors up above. It isn't like GPTs don't happen here, that is the entire point of emerging chemtech like Shimmer coming to light, but it can become less likely for those things to appear in areas facing economic and environmental challenges. Much like the real world, the difference between those that have and those that have not can make a sizable impact when it comes to innovation and those who bear the risk of development. Before emerging technology can create robot Jesus and enable more child martyrs, it has to be invented. Hex tech seems like it comes about slowly and then all at once. Like many GPTs, before it becomes a practice, it's a theory. AI isn't so different. You might be thinking that it got its starts in the 2020s with ChatGPT, or maybe even the 1990s with Deep Blue, an AI chess program beating out Garry Kasparov, a chess grandmaster and former world champion, but it is far older than all of that. The idea of thinking machines goes all the way back and likely predates old world philosophers like Descartes, who we can blame not only for much of the philosophy behind thinking machines and ideas like the Matrix, but we can also attribute to him some of the complex math that guides modern AI. So while artificial intelligence seems like it has come about suddenly, the building blocks have always been something on our minds. And the same goes for Runeterra. In Arcane, Hextech as a theory has been on the mind for generations, but instead of a thinking machine, it's classified as a way to control the arcane that's only realized with the theory of Hextech. That theory directly leads to Jayce's potential banishment and his research being locked away. Something that doesn't feel so far off from historical events like that of Tesla's notes being confiscated after his death, or the church's vocal denouncement of heliocentrism in the early 1600s. There have been many times that as we progress and come upon new ideas and technology, that those in powers would find it easier to bury them. But through the lockdown of emerging scientific views, a funny thing happens. In modern times, we know it as the Streisand effect, where trying to lock away a specific fact only makes it more widely known. When companies and individuals in positions of power realize they can't make the most of those emerging views, that's when they get suppressed, for fear of losing that cutting edge and destabilizing the potential legacy. This is exactly what happens in Arcane. Hextech and the gemstones that power it are only pulled together by liberating Viktor and Jayce's research that the Council had locked away. Now that research isn't just something coming out of a desire for Jayce and Viktor to enhance society, though that's certainly their initial driving force. Instead, there's an additional motivation. Notes that show Jayce's research partner, Viktor, well, he could probably fight off the progression of his deadly affliction with the help of Hextech. This isn't so far off from our own goals when it comes to the emerging development of things like artificial intelligence. AI starts off as a way for us to gain what we've lost. Take BCIs, or brain-computer interfaces, for instance. These are small microchip implants we think of when we think about Neuralink and their first patient. Someone who felt their quality of life had been impacted severely was able to regain some of that. Using emerging technology to improve our lives, that is typically the goal of innovation. At least that's the way things usually start with GPTs that are in the development stage. But we are well past the theoretical and the initial development in our own timeline. And Arcane comes to speed on this by the start of episode 4 in season 1. After proof of concepts are realized and the age of Hextech is ushered in, it's only really done in a way that facilitates the growth of enterprise and government, even for innovators like Jayce and Viktor. Luckily for everyone though, there is still a ton of room for innovation. Much like real-world GPTs, those who have means get to play with things first and direct the technology's growth through investment, while others have to wait for the mass production to facilitate access. Even as the creators, they're not able to just build freely here, though it's clear both Jayce and Viktor want to. It's a complex dance of investment and idealism. Instead, both of them have to offer innovation to the invention that empowers the political and economic side of the spectrum through things like building the Hex Gates. Alongside the Hex Gates, this transactional relationship of research and development calls for the development of the second generation of Hextech gemstones. The first generation of Hextech crystals were extremely volatile, but refinement of the process allows the technology to hit new highs. Though these safety measures aren't super exciting on the marketing side, they do help pave the way for mass adoption. We've seen this ebb and flow with AI through something called the hype cycle, where innovation within the industry creates high and low points for both business and public engagement. Safety measures rarely bring us to a high point in the hype cycle, but what they can facilitate does. Think of it like the OpenAI o1 model that got released. It works on a chain of thought process, thinking through a response step by step. This process was a wild step forward in governance alignment on the company side of things, increasing the resistance to jailbreaks by incredible numbers. It did nothing for the general public in their day-to-day, but it was great for business. Because OpenAI had a model better equipped for safety, some things, like AI agents, can be easier implemented down the road, and new businesses that may have turned away before might find reinvested interest. The idea of safety and back-end development leading to critical invention is something we see paralleled in the Progress Day episode. Here, Jayce and Viktor present Heimerdinger with the Atlas Gauntlet and the Hex Claw that eventually becomes Viktor's third arm. Both of these things bring magic to the common man, in Jayce's own words, but notably neither of these things lessen the burden on the people. Though the Atlas gloves in theory means that the physical work in the mine should be less stressful, that's not where the focus is. Jayce says here that the mining colonies can work faster and without fatigue. Enterprise has only ever cared about the first. If health had been the primary concern of Piltover, then Zaunites and miners that keep that progress in Piltover moving wouldn't have had to experience the gray, or maybe it wouldn't have been as problematic as it was. All of that to say, even though the focus is on the second generation power source, both Viktor and Jayce end up offering items outside of the ordered design cycle that don't serve their original goals, but it does allow them to continue investing in a way that feels closer to their original intent. Putting the Atlas gauntlets in the hands of miners really only enables Piltovian lords to rent them out in the same way that emerging technology has done in the real world as a way to increase the bottom line. Subscription services. Right, so it's development blinded by altruism instead of development supporting altruism. So the presentation overall is quite impressive to Heimerdinger, but he immediately advocates for a longer development process of an additional 10 years in the name of safety. Something that's underscored by the Hex Claw going off only moments before and cinching Heimer's Poro companion. You find this idea too a lot in modern AI journalism, where calls for slowing down the development of AI is one of the foremost issues on the mind of ethicists. When it comes to presenting this technology during Progress Day, Jayce eventually tries to lean towards Heimerdinger's cautionary tale, putting the pause on the public release. But he's too late. Jinx steps in, and between the second generation Hextech gemstones and the lab notes, well, now the information can get out there freely. Once started as a choice is stripped away as technology flows into the hands of the people. Technology, no matter where it is, hates to hide behind locked doors, and humans have an awesome habit of ensuring it almost always sees the light of day. Even though ChatGPT is still a proprietary model, it only took a few years for the greater scientific community to reverse engineer ChatGPT-2 with a budget of under $600. Innovation does not want to wait, especially when the promise of what could be has been put into everybody's mind. In technology, there's this idea of multiple discovery theory. Specifically, it's the idea of invention occurring by different individuals or organizations who have never crossed paths. Basically, it just means simultaneous invention. With emerging technology, you can experience this in some really neat ways. Sometimes it means when a big company announces that they'll have some quality of life tweak, you may have already implemented something similar on your website because you and the company both saw what the users were requesting and how the need could be met. With the field of AI seeing this great emergence and information being so readily accessible, I've even experienced a lot of instances of simultaneous invention. In 2023, I made a 24/7 AI-powered DJ named Leo who talked with users over Discord, remember their favorite songs, and always pass on playing tracks it knew you didn't like. And in only a few weeks, Spotify announced that they'd be making a 24/7 AI-powered DJ. Now, do I think Spotify ripped off my idea? No. Does that make cases of multiple discovery theory less frustrating when you think of your personal legacy? Also, no. It's normal to have a sense of pride in creation, but it's also important to not let ego take control of rational thinking. It's crazy to see Jayce's view on this after inspecting items from the Undercity like Jinx's grenades. He's just baffled, bewildered even, that someone from Zaun could put together such sophisticated devices or could reverse engineer Hextech with their notes. He's amazed by it even though his own partner is from the same area. There's some serious hubris here blinding Jayce at this point from seeing reality. Innovation never stops, and neither does business. So Piltover moves forward, willing to pay the price, even if mitigating some risks just means moving it far enough away that it's a Zaun problem now. We see this through the Hexgate failsafes. The Hexgates are the economic motivator behind Hextech, where large cargo ships can be teleported to distant trade capitals. It's built through a web of Hextech gemstones. Though it isn't mentioned directly, we can see a lot by looking at the timeline here. In Progress Day, the Hexgates are already in full use, but the second generation power source, the safer one, well, that's a new innovation, which means the Hexgates are likely built on a more volatile power source. Just a casual mess of explosives, furthering economic progress, I guess. But this also means that the primary motivation for the council first was the economic prospects, leaving improvements on safety as something that could be done years down the line. It's almost like the safety was an afterthought, even though it's being paraded about as a major point of progress. That Hextech gemstone web is placed far underground, something to localize the potential of an explosion from a Hextech gemstone suddenly destabilizing. The one place where the byproduct of it going off would be a Zaunite problem first and foremost. And it is somewhat of a running theme here. We see Piltover problems sort of get pushed onto Zaun as the Grey is also stored within that community. It's just like Echo says, whenever it rains, we're the ones that get wet. Echo's frustration is born out of being raised in a community shaped by the fallout from industrialization and problems being compartmentalized to Zaun. In the real world, we see similar tragedies play out, where factories putting off chemical waste or other industrial byproducts are typically something that happens more frequently in more vulnerable or lower income populations. When the solution is more expensive than the problem, there's generally little motivation for progress. And that isn't something exclusive to old world technologies or extreme events like Chernobyl. As many rightfully point out, AI is a field right now that's rife with critique over the environmental implications, and some of those more localized than others, leading to the possible harm of very specific communities. Memphis, Tennessee saw a huge data center being built by Elon Musk, raising a lot of local concerns about pollution in an area primarily composed of blue-collar workers when compared to neighboring major cities like Nashville. And like it or not, for both the company and the man, this will likely be the legacy that leaves on the local level, one bitter and resentful to their exploitation. It is a very different view on his legacy that benefactors of Neuralink may not share, and while I'm not a big fan of even giving this dude a lot of screen time, it's part of what makes life so nuanced. Legacy is never black and white. Technology doesn't often give us a chance to write our own legacy. Rather, it's how that tech is utilized that often informs what we leave behind. For some, their legacy is a point of pride, something to pin on the chest as they proudly parade about what a use they were to society. For others, it can be a horrific scenario, where there exists understanding of their legacy beyond clout and the glory of someone shouting your name more than someone else's. We see this clearly with figures like Oppenheimer, where his comparisons of becoming death marked an understanding of what an impact such technology would have on the world and the way he was seen within it. The question of how that technological burden can change legacy, that's also a big driving factor for Heimerdinger. He serves as an allegory for Oppenheimer and the nuclear bomb, as many have rightfully pointed out, and in the same moment, that allegory can carry further here. Imagine if a scientist from that era lived on to see something like Tay, a Microsoft AI experiment from the 2010s that allowed Twitter users to interact with a chatbot named Tay who would learn and grow from her interactions with Twitter users, all while being made in the image of a young adult, curious and upbeat. This lasted all of a day as Tay collapsed into extremist rhetoric and essentially was jailbroken until she was praising. It's an explosive moment, but a small one. One that reminded us of the flaws of emerging technology, but also how people are willing to go to some pretty drastic lengths to explore the limitations of that emerging technology. Less than a decade after Tay, the chatbot community isn't just alive and well, it's thriving with the best and worst humanity has to offer. For people working in this field right now, it brings up a lot of questions about what happens when autonomous AI agents and these chatbot personalities are paired together in wartime scenarios. For folks who have seen GPTs bring about disastrous consequences, this would stand as the writing on the wall. For Heimerdinger, Hex Tech is an echo of the past, not in harmony, but rhyming enough to be concerning. Being an immortal being with hundreds of years under his belt, Heimerdinger isn't just older than the city he counsels, he's seen catastrophic events before, spurred on by the pursuit of magic and GPTs. Entire civilizations, whose legacy now boils down to a cautionary tale, leave him pushing back against the potential for progress in spite of raising many generations on the ideals behind it. After all, Piltover's model is try until you get it right, and Heimerdinger has lived through some of the worst things a model like that has to offer, and so the idea of something even more powerful coming about, well, that's terrifying for him. In Heimerdinger's mind, progress is now something to be done over the lifetime of humanity, and not the lifetime of a human. This is where Heimerdinger's fall really begins in Season 1. Usually the job of a mentor in storytelling is to teach the hero, set them up for the journey ahead, and then make the ultimate sacrifice that puts the story in the protagonist's hands. The hero is the legacy the mentor leaves behind, but for Heimerdinger initially there were no heroes, at least not in Jayce and not in Viktor. Jayce even acknowledges this by saying that he has failed his mentor. It isn't until Heimer meets Echo that he's offered a chance at changing his own legacy through an eventual sacrificial climax to his character arc. You might be wondering by now, in this chaos of tropes, emerging technology, and comparisons, if I've forgotten that Shimmer existed, but I haven't. See, while we've been exploring the emerging technology that is AI and Hextech, Shimmer and Transhumanism have been a less loud, but equally driving force for nearly as long. It holds many of the same goals, the same setbacks, and the same rules to invention and innovation that we've seen in Hextech. It's an emerging technology, born from the mind of a creative with an altruistic goal and funded by an outside source seeking to capitalize from the discovery. The difference here is where Hextech brands itself as the optimistic and shining future, Shimmer acknowledges that getting things right sometimes means getting your hands dirty. Which at this point sounds like nearly every pharmaceutical business currently in operation, taking insulin, hiking up the prices while diabetics ration out their medication. It's a controlled market that only a handful of organizations have a strict hold on, which isn't so unlike Silco and the other chem barons. So while Hextech has this sudden explosion on the market, Shimmer has had a quiet rise and build alongside it. It's been spoken about, a general thorn, yes, but it's nothing that would make Piltover capitulate on its own. The nation of Zaun isn't born from Shimmer. Rather, it is a result of Silco and arguably Vander's legacy, which is far more complex than being boiled down to Shimmer or Jinx's Hextech chaos alone. This is important, not just in the storyline, but for our greater discussion on GPTs. Nations can rise in the wake of emerging technology as easily as some can be destroyed by it. Emerging technologies never exist in a vacuum. They may be born out of a desire to improve lives, but history shows us that innovation often veers into unexpected, although sometimes predictable and destructive territories. Piltover's Hextech, a marvel of discovery and ingenuity, it's not an exception. Even before its capabilities are fully understood, those in power seek to weaponize it. This is where Ambessa's storyline picks up and becomes not just compelling, but deeply reflective of real-world military parallels. She is a warrior general forged in the fires of old-world technology, and Ambessa sees Hextech not as a triumph of human ambition, but as a tool, as a means to reclaim her slipping legacy. Her mission to secure Piltover's cutting-edge advancements mirrors how global powers in our own world approach emerging technologies like AI. As someone who's been watching and attending military conferences for a few years now, let me say that most countries seem to feel the exact same way about AI regardless of their personal positions of geopolitical power. AI quickly became a way to redesign the war machine, to be on the cutting edge with anything from new training methods to bridge experience gaps, autonomous vehicles, and so much more to work towards in the future. But it definitely didn't start that way. In 2022 and 2023, it was really just about feeling things out and trying to sniff out if the entire industry was snake oil or not. By 2024, those same conferences had leaned into AI full bore in a quick acceptance of AI as the solution to just about anything. A quick look at DeFitic this year shows just how much the US Air Force wants to put behind this technology and how much the US government has already put behind it. The irony, of course, is that these technologies are celebrated publicly as tools of progress, much like Piltover flaunts Hextech as its crowning jewel. But behind those closed doors, the race for superiority becomes a zero-sum game, a game of survival, of legacy, and power. Ambessa embodies this tension perfectly. Her armor and weaponry pull from the practical ingenuity of old-world tools, but her vision lies in the future, a future where emerging technology can secure her family station and redefine her role in an evolving world. She represents the uncomfortable truth that legacy, for all its aspirational ideas, often boils down to those who can seize and shape it first, regardless of the cost. Arcane weaves this narrative, showing how progress can inspire, divide, and destroy in equal measure. It's a commentary not just on the fictional power struggles of Runeterra, but on the very real battles we face in our own world, with Hextech poised to forever alter the balance of power in Piltover and beyond. We're left to wonder, what is the true price of innovation? Is it legacy, glory, or obliteration? Well, look at the time. It's already been, oh god, it's been like 30 minutes. Okay, I can't keep you guys any longer with me today. Join me next time where we'll explore what happens when emerging technologies like Hextech and Chemtech move from the hands of pioneering inventors and government officials to the masses, and how the fallout reshapes the world of Arcane and maybe our own. See ya, nerds!